Financial support for newborn children bill is set down for committee stage forthwith. So I declare the House in committee for consideration of the budget measures financial support for newborn children bill. Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Speaker. Members, the House and Committee for consideration of the budget measures financial support for newborn children bill. We move to debate on part 1. This is debate on clauses 3 to 31 and schedules 1 to 3. The question is at part 1, stand part. I call Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's my pleasure to speak on committee stages of this bill, which, as my colleagues have pointed out in their previous addresses, that yes, Labor is supporting this bill. I mean, how could we not support the bill? Because it slowly inches ever so slightly towards the ultimate goal that we've always put forward before this House, which is that paid parental leave should be extended to 26 weeks. So how could we not support It's a decent interim position. My colleague is absolutely right. 26 weeks is what we were putting forward before the House as a fiscally responsible point that we could reach within budget whilst returning to surplus. We had mapped out how that could be done. Our ultimate goal, based on research and evidence and feedback from parents, was that 1 year would be an ultimate goal. But we said, look, at this point of the game, we can't see how we're able to manage that yet. It remains a goal for us, but 26 weeks is where we believe we can get to. So having the government stand before us today, Mr. Chair, and say, look, we want to go to 18 weeks, of course we were going to support that. But we certainly have some pointers for them on how they could have improved the bill. Now, we're speaking today on during this first part of committee stages, Mr. Chair, on part 1 of the bill. Before I go into some of the detail, which essentially is around stepping through the timeline for the extension, I want to clarify some questions around the overall cost of these elements of the package, the phasing in from 14 to 18 weeks. The government has set out this implication in the first and second reading that we simply cannot afford to do any more than that. That is absolutely false. And as even the evidence and advice provided by the Department of Labor has set out, and has Peter Gluckman, the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor, has pointed out, we cannot afford not to move to 26 weeks. Not only is it about the outcomes for mother and baby around breastfeeding, it's around issues like resilience for the child, attachment issues. And we know if a child experiences attachment disorder, the consequences of that down the track can cost a significant amount to the taxpayer. Infometrics, in fact, had carried out some research into the issue of poor outcomes for children, particularly looking at the effects of child poverty. It found that it costs the New Zealand taxpayer up to $6 billion per annum as a consequence of poor investment in a child's early years. And I don't use the word poor investment lightly. We under-invest in New Zealand in our children's earliest years, and that's based on OECD comparisons of the amount that OECD nations, developed nations, invest in children's 0 to 5 years. New Zealand, on average, spends roughly half that, and I don't mean parents in this as a state, we spend roughly half what other OECD nations do, roughly 20 versus $40,000. Half. That picks up a bit once you get beyond the early years and once you get into the period where a child enters state education. Now, one of the biggest defining features as to why New Zealand spends less than other countries is our poor paid parental leave. Most nations have recognised the benefit of investing in paid parental leave and have invested rightfully in those early months of a child's life. And there's perhaps no better evidence than what you see come out of groups like the Brainwave Trust. The Brainwave Trust is not a political organisation. It does not purport to represent any particular ideology. It's simply based on science. And it emerged in the 1990s, around the period where we started to being able to base more of our policies around the fact that actually in health we could see now not just what was going on and learn not just what was happening with the brain from doing scans and work once someone had passed on. We were able to do analysis whilst someone was alive, CAT scans, etc., the ability to analyse neurological function provided a wealth of evidence about what the most important stages of development are. And the most telling thing of all is that we learnt in the first 3 years of a child's life, Mr. Chair, in the first 3 years of a child's life, that was the most critical period of development. In particular, that first year. Not only from a physiological development perspective do you see the brain grow the most in that period, you start moving beyond just the functionary stuff around the cortex to actually what goes on in your frontal lobe development. The judgment, trust, all of those important things that we need for a child to be able to respond to the world around it. Now, if you're a child that's deprived of decent attachment and the ability to build trust with a parent or a caregiver, that then flows on to your ability to even concentrate when you're in school. The ability to trust that actually you're going to get the next meal is going to come your way, whether or not you revert to fight or flight. Now, what the Brainwave Trust tells us is that frontal lobe development is optional. It is optional. Now, I hear members on the other side of the House laugh at what the evidence tells us. I find it particularly interesting that a member who belongs to a trust which is involved in a child's early years, HIPPY in particular. I'm sure Dame Leslie Max would be very interested to hear that Sam Lottwinger is laughing about the evidence around a child's early years of development. All of that points to us making sure that no child is deprived in their earliest years. And yet we know from the Child Poverty Monitor that the time when a child spends the most continuous period in poverty is when they are under 4 years old. That is why Best Start extends to the most deprived families for 3 years, because we know that is where we can make the biggest difference. So on part one, Mr. Chair, that sets out the phasing for paid parental leave moving from 14 to 18 weeks. I want to compare that to the phasing that we would have had under Labour's Best Start policy, which instead of which absolutely, as my colleague points out, which we will have come September. Instead of having this phased in by 14 to 18 weeks from 2016, if the government hadn't vetoed Sue Murini's bill, as they clearly intend to do by what they're doing today, we would move from 14 to 18 weeks from July 2014. From July 2014, we propose that we would have exactly what the government is proposing doing in a couple of years from now. We would then move to 22 weeks from July 2015 and to 26 weeks from July 2017. Now, the government says we can't afford that. The government, which I must point out, has spent $40 million on private schools. Private schools have got $40 million out of this government, and yet they're telling us that children, babies, that we can't afford to invest a little bit more in them and invest to save. And I heard Tracy Martin saying this as well. This is about investing to save further down the track. I've already talked about the Infometrics report, which is predominantly based on the amount we save from, for instance, preventable hospitalisations, remedial education, etc., etc. But what about the simple fact that we spend $90,000 on imprisoning someone in any given year? $19,000 per year is what we spend imprisoning someone. Now, someone may say to me, well, what's the link between that and a child's start in life? Well, the fact that 90% of our prison population have literacy issues. that an estimate of 60% have contact with child, youth and family. All of the things that we are spending a ridiculous amount of wasted taxpayers' dollars, you could spend a tiny, tiny proportion on a child's early years, on supporting families, on early childhood education, where if you invest $1, you save 11. All of these areas are about investing to save. So the government's argument about we can't afford to do it is absolutely untrue. We cannot afford not to do it. These are the areas where we really make a critical difference, not only in a child's potential and a family's well-being, but we ultimately save every single taxpayer money down the track. And Mr. Chair, I want to speak in my next address, because I have every intention of speaking at least in total for an hour on this bill at the very least. I look forward to Simon Bridges making at least that contribution. In fact, I challenge to match me call for call. Simon, call for call, yes.
Mr. Chair,
Honourable Simon Bridges.
we'll see whether I take Jacinda Ardern up on that